Hey everyone. I actually recorded this AMA last night, and as I was editing it today, I realized I missed this great opportunity to plug Stanford Medical School's latest music parody video or parody music video. I don't know which one it is, but anyway, they recently posted it. They did an amazing job, and you should definitely check it out. I will put a link to their video in this video's description. And someone may make a cameo appearance in it, so you should definitely check it out. Anyway, here's the actual AMA. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my 500,000 subscriber AMA. Once again, thank you so much to all the support and kind words you've shared with me over the years. I'm very thankful that you found my work to be helpful. For the AMA, there was a ton of great questions. I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be able to answer them all and still keep this video within a reasonable duration. I hope I'll have a chance in the not too distant future to answer each question in writing. That is, sort of respond to the comment on the AMA announcement. But for now, I'm going to tackle about 30 questions, give or take. All right. First question. I've always wondered, what is your daily schedule? How do you manage to keep up with work, maintaining this YouTube channel, family life, etc.? I have an unusual luxury in that my clinical duties are relatively light on account of only working about 75% time. And of that, about half is bought out by our medical school for teaching. So I'd say overall, my time is on work at least is split roughly evenly on clinical care in the hospital and teaching pre-clerkship students at the medical school and making videos for this channel. However, the schedules, they don't align in any way. So, for example, my clinical duties are scheduled by the week. So I might have 1 week on wards, then a week without clinical duties, then a week of inpatient med consult, then another week without clinical duties. Meanwhile, my teaching responsibilities are by the half day, averaging 2 half days in the classroom per week, which is true whether I'm on or off service. So this results in some weeks being super busy and other weeks being really light, which is, one reason why my video upload schedule here on YouTube is so inconsistent. Something else that helps with keeping up with work, which I don't necessarily recommend, is I probably don't sleep very much, at least not as much as I should. For example, most of my videos, like this one, are being recorded at night after the rest of my family is asleep because some weeks that's the only time I can do it and the only time that it's quiet enough to record. Lately, I've been watching the Strong Diagnosis series, and the question I have stumbled upon is about estimating pretest probability. I've read that it can be equated to the prevalence of the disease in a given population if there is no other data. Is there a comprehensive list of disease prevalence somewhere that one could use on a day-to-day basis? In other words, how do you personally estimate pretest probability, and how do you implement this concept in practice? That's a great question. I don't know of a single resource that lists disease prevalences, which will vary depending upon the age of the patient and sometimes their sex and geographic region. Estimating pretest probability in the absence of good data is one of, if not the biggest challenges in diagnostic clinical reasoning. I can imagine that the problem will someday, eventually, be solved by machine learning and mining huge databases of anonymized patient data where you can just type in your current patient's age, sex, chief complaint, and duration, and the computer will spit back out the breakdown of final diagnoses of every patient to your ER clinic in that demographic with that chief complaint, and you could use that as a reasonable estimate for pretest probability. But I don't know of any EMRs that are close to integrating something like that yet. For now, for common diseases, I just estimate the prevalence in the relevant population. While for more rare disease, I might look at more rare diseases. I'll look it up online. Do you remember everything that you teach here? No, sadly, I do not. Once in a while, I'll rewatch one of my own videos if I'm feeling rusty on a topic that I've covered before. I probably watch the video on coagulation cascade at least, once a year or so. Favorite band at the moment? I don't mean for this to be a cop-out. I don't really have a single favorite band. Within rock, with rock genre, I have a pretty broad taste. If you can imagine all the music that's, stylistically bound by Pink Floyd, Guns N' Roses, and of Monsters and Men, and anything that falls within that huge realm, I'm probably happy listening to it. As you can imagine, it's a pretty large diversity of stuff falling into that that large territory. What's your opinion of the Pfizer booster? The video that you posted is removed. Why? I removed the booster video because its main point was that at the time there was insufficient evidence to recommend the booster to the majority of people, the FDA and med Twitter enthusiasm notwithstanding. However, there's since been a lot more data supporting the booster, and it seemed like it would be misleading to leave the outdated video still up. How do I approach differential diagnosis? What are some amazing books that someone can read and become excellent at diagnosis? I honestly don't know of any one single book that is great at teaching clinical reasoning and how to generate a differential diagnosis. From Symptom to Diagnosis is probably the best for the beginning learner. Frameworks for Internal Medicine is also great. But I think they kind of focus on specific presentations rather than on sort of an approach or sort of rather than approaching clinical reasoning as an independent skill. Now, there is this book by Jerome Cassirer and a few others called Learning Clinical Reasoning, which covers some of this ground. And then there's also this wonderful book here called Medical Decision Making by Sachs Higgins and a former colleague of mine, Doug Owens. And that really goes into some high-level detail about topics like selecting the best diagnostic test for the situation, and expected utility analysis, and how cost effectiveness can influence test selection. But despite its kind of despite its modest size, it's relatively dense reading, and so it's probably not best for a student or intern just learning for the first time. It's really better at for someone that's been doing clinical reasoning for a while. To really get better at diagnosis, you need to read and listen to cases. Try to arrive at diagnoses on your own, and then listen to experts discuss their approach to the same case, and sort of see how you do. See how your analysis stacked up against theirs. That's going to be the highest yield activity. One great resource like that is the Clinical Problem Solvers Virtual Morning Report, where people from around the world discuss cases in real time. This group is very welcoming of students, novices joining them during their morning reports via Zoom. And of course, the morning report, it's not always in the morning, depends on which time zone you're in. So I'll post a link to their website in the video description, and I definitely recommend checking it out. When you present your lectures, your concepts and decision trees make perfect sense, but for me, a medical student, it seems like something I can barely recall, especially if I would get asked a week later. Is it really possible to learn all of your concepts by heart? I don't have the best memory and therefore use mnemonics a lot. That's the only way for me at the moment. But there isn't a mnemonic for every important information or important concept. No, it's not possible to learn and remember all the concepts and facts that you'll learn in medical school or which are covered in my videos. As I said a few minutes ago, I don't remember all the details myself in my own videos. It's just too much. However, familiarity and exposure with the material, that will help you recognize and understand it when you get re-exposed to it later, if you have to look something up when it's relevant to a specific patient or a specific clinical situation. When deciding what to selectively focus on when learning and memorizing for clinical practice, the ability to make a diagnosis is more important to be able to do from memory than knowing how to treat a diagnosis. Because once the diagnosis is made, whether it's heart failure or Parkinson's disease or eosinophilic esophagitis or whatever, and you don't remember how to treat it, you can just look up a review article on that disease or the entry up to date and figure it out and see it. But if you have a symptomatic patient, particularly if it's a patient presenting with more than one symptom, it's going to be hard to find a quick reference that will help you out to the same extent. Mnemonics are okay, but I would caution against over-relying on them. In my experience, learners who heavily rely on mnemonics, particularly for creating differentials, often commit something called base rate neglect, in which every disease in the mnemonic is treated as if it has equal probability. So for example, a patient is admitted to the hospital with an elevated anion gap acidosis, and the novice clinician will insist on checking a salicylate level because it's the S of the famous mud piles mnemonic, even when the patient is clearly in DKA. So in other words, Mnemonics are okay if they're used solely as a memory tool and not as a replacement for thinking. What are the 10 most important papers in recent years? Asking for 10, it's kind of a tall order for a video that's not focused on that. So I'm not going to go through all 10, but I will say the single most important paper, possibly in the history of medicine, is that describing the results of the initial phase 3 trial of the Pfizer BioNTech COVID vaccine published in New England Journal back in December of 2020. The combination of how well designed the study was, how dramatic the results were, and most importantly, how much immediate influence it had on society was really unprecedented in medicine. And I know the word unprecedented, it's been used and overused dramatically throughout the pandemic, but I think it really applies here. In my opinion, the majority of COVID-related scholarship has had a quality ranging from meh to garbage, but this one paper stands way out from the others. Why and when did you decide to become a general medicine physician? Were there any other specialties you considered throughout medical school? This will be an oversimplification of my decision-making process, a dramatic oversimplification, but when I was in med school, I had considered neurology because it's academically rigorous and every single case is interesting. But I have to be honest, I got kind of discouraged by how little it seemed like we could do for the patients I saw during my neuro clerkship. All right, this isn't quite as bad as things used to be in terms of limited therapeutics, but that was a concern. I also had considered pediatrics because I had a modest prior history of teaching middle and high school students, and I really enjoyed the age group, and I love the idea of adolescent medicine as a specialty within pediatrics. But newborns and well child visits were just not my cup of tea. No offense to future pediatricians. If I knew that pediatric hospital medicine was its own thing, I probably would have considered that. But anyway, I decided to apply internal medicine, and when I actually started internship, I wanted to be a cardiologist. I didn't decide on hospital medicine, adult hospital medicine that is, until the end of internship. And that was partly because to be honest, I didn't want to commit to another 3 years of training after residency. And I was also worried that I'd feel discontent with focusing only on a single organ. I still love the heart. If you scan my videos on the channel, you'll see that the cardiovascular system is disproportionately represented. But on most days, I am glad that I went with hospital medicine instead. Speaking of cardiology, I have one question regarding cardiac physiology and pathophysiology. Is there any concise textbook you recommend? And related question, should medical students read textbooks regarding pathology, physiology, and or other clinical subjects? Or are textbooks something that is mainly for the postgraduate level as there's little time in medical school? Wow, little time in medical school for textbooks. I didn't think that medical education would reach this point, but it seems like maybe it has. As to be honest, one of the things that continues to motivate me to make videos is the fact that even now in 2022, there's a lack of decent medical textbooks, aimed at the level of the motivated senior medical student or resident. Most are either incredibly detailed to the point that no student or trainee can reasonably read and retain them, are pocket references that are really intended to remind trainees of material they've already theoretically learned elsewhere, like MGH Pocket Medicine and other books in that series, or they're test review books like First Aid, which maybe it's an okay test prep, but I'll be honest, it's nearly worthless for learning clinically useful medicine. So while I personally liked reading textbooks as a student, and I think I still read them more than most of my contemporary peers, I don't necessarily recommend them for students, with a couple of exceptions. One of my all-time favorites is Blumenfeld's Neuroanatomy Through Clinical Cases, which I still look at from time to time. I think it's perfect for a neuro clerkship, probably a little bit much for pre-clerkship students. Specifically about cardiovascular medicine, our school uses Cardiovascular Physiology by Papano and Weir. It's okay, I guess. I'm not really a huge fan. I do have an ongoing series on cardiovascular physiology, which I'm trying to make an improvement over currently available textbooks. Now, there is one book I would recommend for cardiology for students. That's The Pathophysiology of Heart Disease by Lilly. It's geared more towards early clinical students seeing patients on a cardiology service rather than getting into the weeds of physiology and path that might be expected in a pre-clerkship course. So that's something to keep in mind. There are plenty of other textbooks still commonly used in med school here in the U.S. For example, one's called Step Up to Medicine. That's a common site. Seeing students read that is a common site while on medicine wards. I've not personally read it, but I've heard it's a decent resource for studying for the medicine shelf exam and Step 2. But as I sort of implied earlier, that doesn't always translate to being a good resource for actually learning medicine. But, once again, I haven't read it. So in short, I don't recommend most textbooks, although there's a small handful that I think are probably worthwhile. A related question: what piece of advice would you give a med student interested in cardiology or general internal medicine? How to improve myself as a future doctor? What is the most important thing to do now? I hate textbook reading and I use Qbanks. Is that normal? For those of you not familiar, Qbanks are online repositories for practice questions. First of all, yes, both hating textbooks and using question banks for learning is totally 100% normal. But beyond that, some other advice for a future cardiologist specifically: learn ECGs. There are very few things on the ward more deserving of a facepalm than seeing a cardiology fellow incapable of reading an ECG. Also, the physical exam plays an incrementally larger role in cardiology than in many other specialties, and bedside echo is huge, meaning not just interpreting imaging recorded by someone else, but also getting comfortable with acquiring the images yourself with portable devices. Certainly no one expects a med student or intern to be doing their own echoes, or even a resident doing their own echoes. But every opportunity you have to practice either the exam or echo, make use of that. There are several questions that asked about the process of being able to practice in the U.S. after training outside the U.S. I gotta be honest, I know virtually nothing about that. We certainly have doctors at Stanford who went to medical schools in Europe, Canada, India, Latin America. I'm just not familiar with the steps they needed to take in order to practice here. To specifically ask one question about how internationally trained doctors are perceived at Stanford, I have not sensed any distinction at all. And this doesn't directly affect me, so maybe I'm oblivious to it all. But you would never even know where a faculty member trained unless you looked at their entry in the physician directory, which most people really just don't do with their peers or about their peers. Which is not researching our colleagues' backgrounds like that. So I imagine it's more difficult to become faculty at a major academic center as an international graduate. Largely because the folks doing the hiring are not going to be very familiar with how prestigious or rigorous the schools or training programs were for those applicants in other countries. But once someone's on the faculty, as far as I can tell, they're perceived the same way that everyone else is. The assumption is that you wouldn't have been hired if you weren't qualified. I feel like everyone is kind of treated the same way. Like I said, we don't even know where people went to training. So I'm from Eastern Europe, and at our hospital, there is an urge in the ER to hand over the patient to another doctor without thinking too much about the case. I've seen this kind of practice leads to unnecessary tension between the doctors on the ward and the ER team. Do you think that's a problem? What would the solution be? So this is a phenomenon that is sort of discussed, or the perception is that this is a phenomenon, I should say, which is discussed in the US too. And I can think of a two-pronged solution. First, every hospital-based physician should spend some time in their own ED, not just walking through, but actually rotating through emergency medicine as a resident and seeing patients in the ED as an attending. It will lead to a perspective on how busy it can be and how much less information the ED has to work with sometimes. Particularly during our COVID surges, sometimes emergency rooms, they're filled with admitted patients who are just boarding, waiting for a bed somewhere else, and the ER docs, they're seeing critically ill patients in the hallways. It's just a giant mess. I think a larger, more systemic solution, which might not apply to Eastern Europe as much as it would here, the U.S. needs to improve access to primary care and urgent care to eliminate patients coming to the ED for things that are not emergencies. At least half of the patients who walk into the U.S. To U.S. emergency rooms would have been more appropriate to have been seen as an outpatient somewhere, but they just couldn't get an appointment. ED docs have less time to work up complex inpatient-bound cases when they are busy diagnosing strep throats and refilling expired antihypertensive prescriptions. Even though those things are easy, they still take time. So when a patient is admitted without a thorough ED workup or without a thoughtful differential diagnosis, it's usually not the personal fault of any one ED physician. The ED's primary responsibilities is initiating emergent treatment, figuring out who needs to be admitted and who can be discharged, and for admitted patients, which admitting service is most appropriate. Especially these days, I think anything they have the bandwidth to do beyond that, that's kind of like a bonus. If anything, to be honest, that's the fun, interesting part of medicine, or at least for me, is making diagnoses. And so, to be honest, if the ED nailed every single diagnosis on a patient before I ever saw them, I would get kind of bored. So, it's okay for me, if the ED hasn't figured everything out. All right, next up, I am a physician currently working as a hospitalist in a community hospital. I have noticed that I am losing knowledge on things I do not encounter on a daily basis. How do you keep your knowledge updated? What resources do you recommend for a hospitalist? And related to that is, my question is, how do you stay up to date with the new emerging treatments on so many diseases, and also not forgetting diagnostic steps and treatments for illnesses that you don't encounter as often in your practice? Do you study a bit every day? The way I keep up to date is I make videos. That's how I stay up to date and remember things, at least partly. For example, my ongoing series on underappreciated diseases is mostly made up of conditions that I saw recently in the hospital and which I felt it took too long for me to diagnose. The Approach to Symptom series, where I dissect out how to evaluate a patient presenting with a specific common symptom, that was partly motivated by me feeling insufficiently knowledgeable during some morning reports when it came to building differential diagnoses, or at least, feeling like I didn't have as robust a framework or organization for my thought process. In previous years, another way I stayed up to date was on Twitter, where people I'd follow would tweet out important articles or interesting physiology tutorials, as you may have seen for those of you on the platform. But unfortunately, I've mostly left Twitter these days because the pandemic just sort of cranked its toxicity level up to 11. But, if you either don't mind the toxicity or you are better at avoiding it than I was or am, Twitter can be a great resource too. While I work on videos more days than not, and I'm frequently looking up things regarding my current patients, I have to be honest, I very rarely study in any conventional sense. Hey, Dr. Strong, I'm wondering whether and how much you've incorporated POCUS into your practice. I realize it's a huge topic, but wondering if you have any plans down the road for some videos on common uses in inpatient medicine. I've actually not incorporated it as much as I wish I had, or as much as I thought 5 years ago I would have by now. The limiting factors, devices are still expensive, and I feel like I would probably lose one if I owned it myself. And also sort of a lack of opportunity to learn. I graduated residency well before POCUS was mainstream on the wards, and despite attending multi-day ultrasound conferences, I still don't feel confident enough to use it for anything more than really rudimentary questions. So unfortunately, I don't have any current plans for POCUS videos on the channel. I'm sorry. When did you become confident enough in your clinical judgment, and how to improve it as a first-year intern? I don't remember being particularly confident as an intern, like in general, period. What really helped was immediately after residency, I worked as a hospitalist at a private community hospital for a year, a place that not only lacked residents and fellows, but lacked a lot of subspecialty services. So, for example, we had an open ICU, open CCU, and open neurocritical care unit. And in the ICU in particular, there was no one to call for backup. Vent management was you and the RT. Pressor management, that was just you. And I had some blunders along the way. Nothing, luckily, with catastrophic consequences, which, as I said, was mostly good luck more than anything. But, this environment was one of the things which indirectly led to this channel. Because I knew that I was struggling with some critically relevant topics that year. On my down weeks, I read a ton, and I actually created lecture notes. And even, this is going to sound super nerdy, even sampled textbook chapters on topics that I didn't feel confident with. And some of this material, originally intended just for myself, became the basis of some of my first videos on this channel. So, for example, like the vent management, ventilator management series was like all part of this. So it was really after that year when I came back to an academic hospital, after having trial by fire, is when I finally felt confident, or at least when I felt like my confidence level was better calibrated to my skill level. But that doesn't mean I still don't frequently question myself. I think it's important to strike a balance. If you aren't confident enough, you can't commit to decisions, and the lack of confidence won't engender trust from your colleagues and your patients. But if you are too confident, you won't ask for help when you need it, and you won't accurately convey the presence of uncertainty to your patients and colleagues. So, like getting back to you as an intern and improving clinical judgment, I think, and confidence in your clinical judgment, the best way is to not lean too much on your resident with the assessment and plan on your patients. Try to always come up with a plan on your own and then run it by the resident or the attending to see if they agree, rather than aiming for a collaborative approach or open free-form discussion on rounds, which too often ends up with the senior-most person on the team dictating the care. So again, try to come up with a plan on your own, put it out there, and if it's great, it's awesome to get positive feedback. If it's needs a little bit of work or some revision, that's a great way to learn. What are your thoughts about practicing outpatient internal medicine, especially if your training is inpatient heavy? How do you continue learning as an attending in a situation like this? This is really hard, and if a student told me that they were interested in practicing outpatient internal medicine, I would very strongly advise them to seek a residency program that had a primary care track, or even consider a family medicine residency. Many US IM residencies do not properly prepare physicians to practice primary care. That's just the way it is. And conversely, I also think that an IM residency should not be required to have senior residents do weekly primary care clinic if the resident has already differentiated to an inpatient-based specialty. Now, if you're already an attending trying to do outpatient medicine after an inpatient-heavy residency, I can be honest, I'm afraid I don't have any great advice other than to find someone a few years older than you who had the same problem, and there's many of them out there, and ask what they did and how it worked out for them. Do you think if we were to implement a medical education course in high school, for example, teaching the kids about medical thinking and reasoning, and how some of the more common medical emergencies or diseases are evaluated and treated, the trust of the people in the medical workers would rise and this situation would get better? I think this sounds good in principle, but it's hard to find someone adequately qualified to teach that kind of course at the high school level. My son, he's in middle school now, and he just had a 2-month-long health elective, and it was truly abysmal. Every single day he would come home and share some, facts that he had learned that were absolute pseudoscientific nonsense. The unfortunate truth is that anyone with the relevant expertise to teach such a class and do a good job is going to be aiming for a higher income level than a public school teacher is making, at least here in the US, where they are super underpaid. So I think, again, it sounds great. I see it being really, really hard to pull off well. What do I look forward to in the future of medicine? Universal healthcare would be great, which will hopefully, among other things, bring about standardization of EMRs and elimination of ridiculous billing and coding requirements. Will that happen in my lifetime? Probably not, but a guy can dream. When approaching the medical school admissions process, is it possible for someone who was an underperformer in undergrad to redeem themselves and take or retake more classes for the sake of looking impressive on a transcript? Are there other things that could land an acceptance, such as conducting research by yourself and accumulating vast amounts of writing, or perhaps even job experience? The short answer is yes, it is possible, but the more redemption that's necessary, the more uphill the climb will be. I've not been involved in medical admissions in any way for years now, and even if I was, my experience would be skewed. So take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But if we're talking an overall GPA under 3.0, for example, from a second-tier undergrad, you're going to need something really impressive and optimally distinctive for schools to even consider you. As far as conducting research by yourself, I can't imagine what research an individual without medical training could undertake by themselves, presumably without funding, that would be notable enough and successful enough to catch anyone's attention. And it's not a matter of not being smart enough or not being capable intellectually, but it's a matter of you need equipment, you need lab skills, you need mentorship, and it just exceeds what's realistically possible for a person to do on their own, irrespective of motivation. Now, when you mention job experience, if you have an undergrad degree related to biology or chemistry, could definitely leverage that into working in a lab for, a few years. And maybe if you're lucky, you manage to get your name on a paper or two. And maybe that's enough to score some interviews, if your GPA was that low beforehand. For other people whose undergrad was very strong but took gap years before applying to residency, just keep in mind that, gap years are great. Gap years are totally fine, but they should be filled with something meaningful. Meaningful does not necessarily mean something directly related to medicine. It could be an elementary school teacher. It could be a successful writer, being a parent. I've known medical students, medical students who were in the Peace Corps or Teach for America, things like that. But those are for people who did really well in undergrad. If your undergrad academic performance wasn't so great, probably the best thing you can do is to do sort of a post-bac program and really knock it out of the park. And again, get some kind of research experience under your belt to have a shot at a U.S. medical school. What's the most exciting aspect of practicing medicine for you these days? On the other hand, what are the things that you are tired of or can't stand anymore of your daily practice? The most exciting part of practicing medicine for me is discussing an interesting diagnostic dilemma with the residents and students. When a patient is admitted with an unusual collection of symptoms, exam findings, lab abnormalities, and we're all sort of sitting around just pontificating about what it could be, working through the differential diagnosis together as a team, like that's awesome. Like I love that. That I could do that kind of thing all day. What can't I stand? As implied earlier, billing and coding. It's not that it occupies that much time, but it's such a waste. It's ridiculous. And it's just utterly soul-sucking to have to even think about it. Do you think there is any use for the physician in patients' Apple Watch data, such as trends in SpO2, heart rate, and ECG? In short, yes. My wife, she's an electrophysiologist, that is a cardiologist who specializes in heart rhythms, and she frequently has patients send her data from their wearable devices, not just Apple Watches, but other things too, to help make clinical decisions. And they talk about the information that the devices provide, and they make a decision about it, about medication changes, for example, or the need for a pacemaker, for example. And so, yeah, that stuff definitely comes up. There were a number of comments that contained requests or suggestions for specific video topics. Just to address a few, talking about real patient cases of mine on YouTube would be great. Like I think it would be really interesting and valuable, but it's more or less impossible. My hospital has very strict rules against discussing patients on social media. Even after removing what's legally considered PHI or protected health information, it sort of still lies somewhere between forbidden and strongly frowned upon. So I think we're going to avoid that for the time being. Medical statistics, though, is on my short list for upcoming topics. For the longest time, I have been holding off on biostats because I had wanted to do the subject justice by having an entire series on it, but I couldn't find the time, and so it kept getting pushed further and further back. And at this point, I just realized I'm never going to have enough time to carve out, enough bandwidth to carve out the time to really do it justice for a dedicated biostats series. So instead, the plan now is just a single robust, maybe 30 or so minute overview, maybe around March, but we'll see. Do you have a teaching position in real life, or do you only do this YouTube channel? Yes, as mentioned earlier, I do have a teaching position in real life. I'm a clinical associate professor at Stanford, located in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. I'm also a hospitalist, or specifically an adult hospitalist, which is an internal medicine doctor who specializes in the care of hospitalized patients, which gives me the opportunity to see quite a diversity of acute, complex medical problems. So here's a kind of a tough one. What age do you think medical people like doctors, nurses, shift workers, etc., should retire from the medical field? In principle, I don't think there should be any specific age for doctors or nurses for that matter. If an internist's mental faculties are still strong and they continuously work to stay up to date, I don't see why they can't continue to work well past the typical retirement age for most fields. After all, the most recent 2 American presidents have been north of 70, and it's hard to argue that someone is too old to be a doctor or a nurse, but not too old to hold the nuclear launch codes. So, however, there's a problem with that in practice, particularly with physicians. So when a physician's cognitive function is slowing, and maybe they don't stay up to date as much as they should, and maybe they are a surgeon or other proceduralist, and they start losing their manual dexterity or vision, there's typically no process for an independent entity to tell them they need to stop. The state medical boards, they don't contact individual doctors to say that you're just not sharp enough to do this anymore. I mean, how would they know? And how often do hospitals decide to revoke the privileges of a surgeon on the basis of lost dexterity? Maybe younger colleagues reach out to stubborn or unaware elderly physicians and try to talk them into retirement. But that seems like a really awkward conversation that probably doesn't happen very often. Even with elderly drivers here in the US, there's a mechanism to get them off the roads by which you can report them to the DMV, and the DMV they can mandate a repeat driver's test. In medicine, it just doesn't have something like that. So, in short, theoretically, there isn't any one specific age, but in practice, there probably should be, particularly for surgeons or proceduralists. This would not be without precedent. The FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration here in the U.S., has a maximum age for commercial pilots, which I think it's relatively young, like 65. That's probably a bit young for surgeons, but maybe an absolute cutoff of like 75 for anyone who works in the OR or cath lab or IR suite. Maybe. Personally, I would never go to a surgeon in their 70s. I don't care how esteemed or experienced they are. That's not to say that a surgeon can't retain their procedural skills clear into their 70s, but there's just no way to know if that's true for any one specific surgeon from the patient's perspective. Apologies if I just offended some of my colleagues. With the rising prevalence of medical education videos and social media medical educators, have you found your patients more or less well-informed, or just getting more paranoid? A little of both, often in the same patient. Despite all the criticism of Dr. Google and sayings like, "Don't confuse your Google search with my medical degree," I think the profoundly increased availability of medical information for patients has been a net benefit. There have been countless times that a patient or relative has suggested something to me about a diagnosis or treatment that I haven't actually thought of yet. Is it sometimes frustrating when a patient is convinced they have some rare disease that they just discovered on Wikipedia, which they definitely don't have? Sure, that's frustrating, but that is not at all common, at least not with my patient population. So on the whole, I think it's better that patients are better informed by the internet. I think this makes everything much, much easier for the physician. It makes patients feel more empowered. And I think it's a net benefit, even if there are occasional downsides. What does it take to be an extraordinary physician? Who is your role model? That's a big question to answer, but oversimplified, an extraordinary physician is one who is knowledgeable about medicine, listens to patients, is willing to politely push back on patient requests for meds or tests when they are not indicated. They offer the risks and benefits of more than one treatment option for a new symptom or abnormal finding. And that includes the option of doing nothing, like letting the patient know, if they just watchful waiting, what would happen with that. They take the time to explain everything at a level appropriate for the patient's individual health literacy. They work at staying up to date with the latest studies and new treatments. They interact respectfully with their peers and other members of the broader medical team, and is willing to admit when they don't know something. In terms of role model, I don't have anyone specific I can name. There certainly have been physicians who have influenced me, positively that is. Mostly people who were not famous and whose name you would not recognize, but people who still demonstrated what compassionate care was and what enthusiasm for lifelong learning looked like. One person whose diagnostic acumen does stand way out as something to aspire to was Faith Fitzgerald. She's a former IM, or she was a former IM program director at UC Davis, and unfortunately she just passed away last month. And I can remember seeing her in action at the Stump Professor event at a conference when I was an intern, and she was like the Sherlock Holmes of medicine. If Sherlock was also a nice person. But aside from her, even now, I am constantly learning from my colleagues in the hospital and at our med school. Many of our classes are co-taught with other faculty, and we rotate each quarter with which faculty we co-teach with. And it gives me this incredible opportunity to learn from directly watching and interacting with medical professionals whose approaches to medicine are different than mine, and who have different skill sets, and who dispense, little different pearls of wisdom than I know. It's really wonderful. I absolutely value observing more skilled and experienced physicians and educators. But having said that, my career goals are unique. I've been trying to carve out my own space, and there's not any one specific person who I look up to and think, that's exactly the physician I want to be. You know, I want to be something new. So in short, I don't see myself as having a specific role model per se. How do you personally work with compassion fatigue and burnout? Compassion fatigue and burnout have been huge problems. There's no doubt about that. It's obviously made much worse by the pandemic. I talked about it in a video back in November. As far as how I personally deal with it, as I mentioned, my clinical duties are relatively light compared to many hospitalists. I appreciate how lucky I am. Aside from just being out of the hospital, teaching helps too. Playing with my kids, eating well, carving out time to exercise. But in short, the only magic strategy is keeping the hours spent in the hospital or in clinic under some threshold, which will be different for everyone, and it even varies within the same person across time. Cutting your hours back to maintain a healthy work-life balance and prevent burnout, that is nothing to be ashamed of at all. It's totally fine if it's necessary, and if anything, by supporting your own mental health, it's actually going to be helping your patients in the long run. And it probably feels weird to have me talk about like how I love medicine, I love taking care of patients and diagnosing diseases, and then I'm also saying, yeah, but actually you want to not do it too much, but there's a balance, and if you go all in the hospital, and especially if you have a stressful environment, that's going to be setting you up for burnout, and so you have to sort of maintain that work-life balance. I think to keep yourself grounded, keep yourself from just being beaten down too much by everything around you. What tools do you use to make and edit your videos? I actually have a video on the channel that goes into a little bit more detail about this, or a lot more detail about this. I'll post a link to this in the video's description. But in extreme brief, my equipment is a giant widescreen, 4 standing lights with soft boxes, noise-absorbing panels to reduce echo, and the Rode NT3 mic on a stand, which is right here. For software, I use Audacity for audio editing. I predominantly use PowerPoint for creating any novel diagrams or simple figures, which probably seems weird, like why using PowerPoint to draw? But I've actually, over the years, I found it's actually the fastest way for relatively simple things, faster than Photoshop, definitely faster than Illustrator or sort of dedicated drawing programs. And then I use Adobe Premiere Pro to stitch the audio, the video, and the diagrams to stitch it all together. How can a family physician become a cardiologist? Is it worth undergoing an advanced echocardiography course for 1 year? So I've not personally heard of someone who did a family medicine residency who then went on to do a cardiology fellowship, at least not here in the US. Maybe it's possible somewhere. I just haven't heard of it. However, there was a time when it was possible to get formal training in echocardiography without having first done a cardiology fellowship. Theoretically, that could be a family medicine doctor doing that. And I actually looked into this myself about 10 years ago, but I found I found a few programs, but I ultimately decided it was really not worthwhile because it would be hard to find an academic hospital willing to have a non-cardiologist perform or interpret echoes. And so when I saw your question, though, I did a quick Google search to see if I could find any programs in the U.S. that still offered this to non-cardiologists, and I honestly didn't see any. But it feels like there would be a market for that, especially for things like generalists working in rural, underserved areas. And I think it would be, if for someone in that situation, practicing in that environment, it would be definitely worthwhile. But I didn't see any programs that offer it anymore. But you may just need to search around some more. There's probably some out there because I definitely feel like there would be a market for that. Do you have students and juniors on your tail during daily rounds? No, it's actually, to be honest, it's more like I'm on the tail of my interns and residents. At least that's how I like it to be. They're the ones that I want driving the care decisions and having most of the discussions with the patients. You know, I generally prefer to take more of an advisory role while in rounds, and leave the act of leading rounds up to the resident. It doesn't always work out that way, especially when the resident is getting hammer paged every 2 minutes about admissions or transfers or whatnot. But that is my goal. I want the resident to be leading rounds, and I sort of follow along but let them run the show. Have you considerably changed your opinion on an aspect of your medical practice in recent years? If so, what was it? And after my transition from a medical student to a resident, I have noticed patients don't really follow textbooks and can present in any way. What is your approach when you see a patient with vague symptoms? To close out the AMA, I've bundled these questions together because my answer to them overlaps quite a bit. I've had a gradual realization about several things over many years that fundamentally comes back to what was said in the question, exactly what was said. The fact that most patients don't present with a classic textbook description of the disease they are ultimately diagnosed with. And there are consequences from this. For example, I think many discharge diagnoses, that is, the diagnosis that's listed at the top of the discharge summary that is intended to explain the symptoms the patient came to the hospital for, I think a lot of these diagnoses are presumptive and, in more times than we like to admit, not accurate. Another is that I think we are more likely to discount a patient's symptoms when their presentation does not conform to a disease that we can easily identify from our training. My changed opinion about this is that I now think that medicine is less precise overall than I was taught to believe. Sometimes people will frame this realization as medicine is more of an art than a science. But I actually disagree with that characterization, at least in this context. Because probability and uncertainty lie totally within the realm of science. We often discuss the uncertainty of diagnostic tests using terms like specificity and positive predictive value, but we nevertheless shy away from uncertainty in our diagnoses rather than leaning into it and trying to understand it better. Some of this diagnostic uncertainty is due to our cognitive biases and due to limitations of our own personal knowledge, and some of it is due to limitations of the collective knowledge of medical science. And we all need to accept that we will be unable to give a diagnosis to every patient, no matter how good we are, and that some of the diagnoses we give will be wrong. And that's not because we're bad doctors, but because the practice of medicine is probabilistic. This results in a conclusion that's non-intuitive to most laypersons. Just because a misdiagnosis occurred, it does not mean a clinician made a mistake. Despite me having plenty of videos on diagnostic frameworks and algorithms and how certain diseases present with this or that time frame, or in a certain demographic, or with this or that associated symptom, that's just a simplified, most typical version of pathology that can actually be quite diverse. There's a common saying in medicine, patients don't read the textbook. But there's another side to that. Our textbooks are incomplete. They only include the most common presentations because otherwise the amount of information they contained would be overwhelming. I'm reminded of a point I made in a video on illness scripts as part of the Strong Diagnosis series. And for anyone not familiar, an illness script, in extreme brief, is a concise collection of organized facts about a particular disease that clinicians store in their memory as a discrete chunk of information. So when comparing the illness scripts of novices with that of expert diagnosticians, novice scripts tend to include only the classic description of the disease's presentation, while the expert scripts either also contain separate atypical variations on the presentation or include a more continuous range of presentations. So as an example, a novice's illness script for lupus might include young woman as the only demographic information, while an expert's illness script for lupus might include a rough age distribution and an approximate female-to-male ratio of the disease. Another issue with the textbook descriptions of diseases is that they were written at a time when doctors, or at least the doctors who were able to write textbooks, were primarily concerned with diseases in white, middle-aged men. And they were written at a time when diseases were diagnosed at later stages in their natural history. So we end up with archaic diagnostic criteria and disease descriptions that even when it was based on the most current technology of the time, it still only described what the disease looked like in a minority of patients. And also, as I said a minute ago, the collective knowledge of medical science, it's incomplete. There are still diseases waiting to be discovered, and unusual disease variants waiting to be described, and uncharacterized connections between known diseases and genetics, and all kinds of environmental factors and diet and things that we haven't even thought about yet. So, going back to the question about how to approach the patient with vague symptoms, which it seems like I got a little bit far away from that question, or if I'm interpreting your question correctly, symptoms that don't conform to a classically described disease presentation, a couple of thoughts. First, don't assume the textbook is always right or complete. Second, remember that atypical presentations of common diseases are more likely than typical presentations of rare diseases. Third, if there are multiple symptoms or lab abnormalities, try focusing in on the one that is the most unusual or has the smallest diagnostic framework. And don't be afraid to use Google. I kid you not. One of the cases from residency that has stuck with me the most was a young woman, early 20s, who presented with a combination of acute hemolytic anemia, some non-specific behavioral changes, and a few other random, modest lab abnormalities. And she was admitted to the heme service for the hemolytic anemia, and she had all the standard hemolytic anemia tests sent, but they failed to identify a cause. And so she gets LP because of the behavioral changes. She gets an abdominal ultrasound. She gets a brain MRI. And after 48 hours, no one had any idea what was going on. But she had an undetectable serum alkaline phosphatase. And we had ignored it because it didn't seem directly relevant to her presentation and because we don't usually think of low alk phos as a problem. However, someone on the team, and I honestly, I'm afraid I don't remember who it was, suggested doing an internet search just for the term undetectable alkaline phosphatase. And the top result was Wilson's disease, which ended up being her confirmed diagnosis. The diagnosis was delayed for 2 days because the patient had an unusual finding, that is the low alk phos, that we didn't know what to do with, and we didn't have a diagnostic framework for it. So again, if your patient has a constellation of symptoms and findings that don't conform to an illness script, look into the weirdest one. If it's something that you're not very familiar with, you should look into it even more so because that's a knowledge gap of yours. Fourth thought, at least I think it's fourth, be open to considering suggestions from the patient. If the patient is convinced the problem is with a certain organ, or they repeatedly emphasize a seemingly irrelevant piece of information, consider that while they aren't a doctor, and they have had more time to think about their condition than you have, and they may have researched it online, and most importantly, I think they may lack the medical vocabulary to describe what they're experiencing in a way that would tap into your memory and trigger a connection between something you've already learned about in the past. Patients are often wrong about their own diagnoses, but they are right more often than doctors collectively give them credit for. Last, develop comfort with uncertainty. Not every disease can be diagnosed even by the world's best diagnosticians at the time of initial presentation. Some diseases need to progress to a certain stage, or until a certain lab test abnormality develops, until it can be identified. And that's frustrating for doctors and patients alike, but it happens. So anyway, that's the last question I'll answer in the video today. Thanks for watching to the end, and thanks again for all the support and wonderful feedback. Sorry about my voice cracking a little bit. It's like 1 a.m, and I think it's my voice has sort of had a rough day today, so I'm sorry about that. And like I said, I'll try to answer some other questions in writing when I have some more time.